Welcome to another session of Technology by Performance. I'm Ken Umansky, your host, as we explore more of the world of technology. Today, my guest is Santoash Rajaram, a seasoned entrepreneur and tech enthusiast. He was a senior software engineer at Apple and a member of the technical staff at Oracle. He built a successful AI-driven insurtech that was ultimately acquired. He excels at creating scalable, user-centric, simple solutions that deliver a quick ROI while seamlessly integrating with organizational workflows. Santosh graduated from Carnegie Mellon University, where he studied management information systems. Well, welcome, Santosh. I'm really happy you could join me today, and that's an impressive resume. Let me start
Thank you.
off with an easy question for you.
Yeah. Mhm.
What does all the noise about AI mean for organizations today? And how should they approach AI to get a real value?
So if you think about where AI is today, it's not a stretch to say that 5, 10 years from now, every organization is going to have a GPT that represents them uniquely, right? There's going to be it's most of the CDOs and CIOs already intuitively get this, that few years from now we're going to be talking about companies having their own language models, right? Now the question is, how do we get there, right? And if you think about where the market is going in terms of when these language models showed up, the market ended up with very sector-specific language models like, claims GPT, contact center GPT, and whatnot, right?
Mhm.
The problem I see with this general trend is that most of these vendor solutions that are very sector-specific or vertical-specific within sub-verticals is that they're too generic, right? And when I say it's too generic, language models perform very well when you give it a very narrow scope in terms of what organization it's operating under and the organizational context. You don't want a claims person walking out. You don't want someone working in your claims team that's just walking off the street and you're asking him to look at a claim. That's not how operational things work, right? If you're looking at like someone to write your emails, give you specific instructions, that'll be fine. But if you're looking at tactical use cases that are a little bit more operational in nature, the general noise in the market doesn't give you that today, right? That's one thing. And the other thing is, if you imagine that end goal is to have every organization represented by a GPT, you're not going to get to that end goal by going to a vendor and getting a claims GPT, right? You're going to go get there by saying, I have these 5 teams that are very impactful, and I'm going to figure out how to make them more productive by creating an AI or language model that helps them. And then if you solve that 5 or 6 or 10 times, then cumulatively you will end up with a GPT that represents your organization because you built it ground up, right? I sort of think of this, Ken, as like the 90s time for the e-commerce. If you remember, back in the day when e-commerce were starting up, everybody wanted to build online stores with e-commerce functionality and whatnot. And everybody ended up with tens of teams that are like relatively large compared to what we do today, and also very expensive to build. And they didn't always work predictably. That's kind of where we are, right? If you fast forward like a couple of decades, now we can launch an e-commerce store in less than an hour.
Right.
And it's very cheap to do so, right? And it's very predictable. I always know how it's going to work, and we've solved it, right? So that's kind of where we are. And in terms of how I would approach it today, I would approach it by starting small. I wouldn't approach it as a claims GPT. I would approach it as, I have a team of 4 claims adjusters, and they spend 40% of their time looking at data from these data sources. How can I give them that 40% back so they can be more productive, right? So if you do that across your claims, your underwriters, your compliance teams, now you're thinking about a GPT that's accretive towards your end goal, right? Of your organization's competitive edge. using like a GPT that is trained for your organization, right? Like that's how I think about it.
So are any organizations yet using AI agents
Right.
to try and get a jump on it? Can you talk a little bit about
Yeah,
that?
if you think about, there's a good and bad thing about like the big players like Microsoft approaching AI, right? So like the good thing is that everybody knows about it and it's great. It's very accessible. And the bad thing is that most of the use cases in the organizations today are collaborative productivity use cases, right? Like, oh, it can read through my emails and respond automatically. It can help me help me write SOW together quickly, that type of stuff, right? If you're So there are organizations out there that are looking at AI from an operational and return on investment in that lens, and the use cases there, or you can imagine, right, all the way from contact center is a very popular example.
Right.
There's several organizations doing that, but if you go away from the contact center because they're like that, it's a very talked about use case. One of the interesting ones that I'm working on right now is marketing intel. So, for instance, you could ingest data about what the marketing information says about all of your competitors, and you can arm your marketing team with information that says how do you talk about yourself when you're pitching your product to someone, right, to a client. That's a very compelling use case because now you just scaled your marketing team from having to spend all of this time accumulating and reading through data. There's a consistency in the pitch that comes across as an organization, and eventually this will as you accumulate more context, this GPT will get better and better, right? Which is very compelling. And there is also compliance and regulation is a big deal in the fintechs, in the finance, insurance, that type of stuff. So that, if you understand insurance and legislation, regulation and legislation, and that's changing constantly. There are projects that that I'm working on where you can automatically index these regulations and then tell you what changed between different revisions of the regulation, how AI, that, for instance, if you're a claims person looking at data processing claims, you need to understand certain regulations that are happening today. And in today's day and age, that's not directly given to the individual working on it. There is a lag in how you get that information. If you have AI assistant helping you through it, AI assistant ultimately understands what the regulations are and the changes that happens on a day-to-day basis or a week-to-week basis, right? So if you get that information, then you have it, and that's a very compelling use case as well, where you have a regulation or a compliance assistant that you can use with your workflow. Those are some of the unique ways I've seen it. Because when you think about use cases in general terms, most people are applying the same thing, right? Yes, emails can be written. Yes, contact center can be done. Those are like the easier ones, but the ones that are sort of out of the box that I've been thinking about is like marketing, compliance. Underwriting is a very interesting use case because now if you can think about the underwriting team getting applications, you could source all the data ahead of time and create an underwriting worksheet, putting together, reducing the amount of time that the underwriters or the underwriting assistant spend getting all of this data. That's another compelling use case as well. See,
Terrific.
all of this use case to me, it needs to have a solid ROI associated with it. Is it cheaper than a person doing it, right? If you're just going off of the common stack that's available out there, it really isn't, right? Like if you end up implementing something that needs to work for your organization in a predictable, compliant way, it's more expensive to do it than just hiring a person to do it today, right?
But a lot of companies are looking at AI and AI agents
Mhm.
as a tool rather than a replacement for people. That it's
That
really
is
helping people become more efficient.
that
Uh,
is correct. Yeah,
is that
absolutely.
true
Yeah,
in the insurance
that is
industry?
very true. That is very true. I didn't mean to say that you're going to replace people, right? Like at the end of the day, if you have a team of 5 and if you give them some productivity boost, they can produce their productivity increases, which means you're getting 2 times the output you normally would. Right now, you can process more claims, or you can go do other things that require more human thought behind it, as opposed to just looking up data and then making a decision, right? So if you're just looking at it from a productivity perspective too, it needs to have an ROI associated with it, right? Like, is it worth the investment I'm making? If you're just purely doing it because of the market, or if you're just thinking about this as a long-term play, most of the time organizations don't get off the first step to a second step, right? Like, it just simply falls apart at some point, because when you're going through a down cycle, it's just simply not worth the investment, because it's not adding any value right now. So that's the first thing you're going to cut. So when I think about AI, I always try to look at it from, if I do this, is there a direct ROI associated with it? And the ROI could be that you're just getting more output from the team, right? Like that's.
So what's the biggest challenge right now for adopting AI?
Biggest challenge, I used to run an ML company before this, and when this was like 6-7 years ago, when we were doing this, the biggest challenge is data, right? Like usable data, as we used to call it. With the language models, data is not a problem anymore. You don't, any data you give, it doesn't have to be in a, you're not making predictions in that sense, right? So data is not a problem anymore. Now I feel like the biggest challenge is building an AI that's predictable and compliant, especially in the financial organizations and insurance carriers and stuff. You need to make it compliant and auditable. If you want to build that fits into that checks all of these boxes, and you want to build it in a way where it justifies ROI, that is really hard, because the cost of creating a solution that checks all of these boxes doesn't justify the ROI. That's the spot we are in. And also, because of the excitement, this is the excitement phase of the AI, right? Like, where everyone's super excited because of the potential, but everyone's sort of like getting caught up in the excitement and not thinking about, what are my data privacy laws that I need to be worrying about? What are the compliance and regulation things I need to be aware of? How do I deal with it when I'm creating an AI solution that's helping me? Or what about AI ethics, right? Like, these kind of things are not forefront at this point, but it will, right? Like, we all go through this, these trends, and once we get to a place where our prefrontal cortex is working again, we will start thinking about it again. But that's the challenge in the today's noisy environment and the excitement phase we're getting caught up in. And I believe that all of these are very solvable problems. It's not like it's unsolvable and it's all doomed. I feel like the way to approach it from a cost perspective is, if you're thinking of building solutions that are specific to individual teams that are accretive towards your end goal of creating your own GPT, then you need to invest in an infrastructure that allows you to create these solutions pretty quickly without involving coding exercise, right? Like, it needs to be operational folks who can make use of your infrastructure to launch their own assistant to get to get a productivity boost, right? That's how you think about it. If you build an infrastructure like that, what happens is you will automatically take care of all of the compliance, regulations, and all of that stuff, because you're building that into the base infrastructure. That's how I think about it. As you can sense, I can probably talk about this for hours.
Well, I appreciate that, and I know my audience appreciates that. What are the emerging AI trends that are going to impact businesses in the next 5 years, as you see it, and how should organizations prepare for it?
So I heard this in a podcast recently. I forget which podcast said this, but basically, language models are getting better, right? Over time. So it's a weekly affair if you're paying attention to AI space, and it's only going to get cheaper and better over time, right? Like, and you need to build solutions that are going to take advantage of that, and not solutions that are going to get replaced by the fact that don't spend time working on problems that'll especially if your organizations whose core business proposition is not like building a language model, right? If you're an organization that is trying to use it, don't try to solve problems that are going to make your solution not relevant anymore because the language models get better. Even if the language models get better, the solutions that you have in place, you should be happy that, oh my God, that's going to make my solutions even better. Right? That's the kind of solutions you should be focusing on, because the general trend is that the language models are going to get a lot better and a lot cheaper, right? And also know that you have to bring organizational context into whatever solution you're building in, right? Basically, all of the language models that are being trained today, unless you're studying them, there's no difference between them at this point, right? Like it's not, from a user's perspective, there's minor differences, but it's not crazy at this point. So they're sort of hitting a plateau it'll get even drastic in the next coming months, years. So if I just abstract that language models are language models, okay, great. And all of these language models are getting trained on data that is available publicly in the internet, right? Like in some way, shape, or form. There are some cases where there is some proprietary data, but generally, the internet is a source for all of these language models, which means if you want to use that language model for your organization, the only way that outperforms your that performs like your organization, people working in your organization, to help them is by introducing your organizational context on what it means to have this kind of data. How do you work in a situation like this? Or what does this term mean for your organization? Because organizations have their own way of working and workflows that impact how a language model should operate within. It'll be like saying the same example, right? Where you have someone walking down the street, you're asking them to pop into your office and answer some question. Can they answer the question looking at the data in your screen? They possibly could, but would it be the same as the person working in the cubicle next to you and asking them the same question? Probably not, right? So you want AIs to behave like someone working next to you, alongside you, throughout your workday, and not someone walking down the street. Once folks get this difference of what language models do and how do I make it specific to me, I think that's where the trend is going, right? In terms of where we are today and where we're going to be 5 years from now or 10 years from now.
Well, Santosh, thank you. Unfortunately, that's all the time we have for today.
That's great. Yeah.
I want to thank you for a stimulating discussion and for the concepts and ideas you brought to us in terms of understanding AI a little bit better. And also, I think the audience learned a lot about how AI needs to be of value both today and into the future. That's really good. How can our listeners contact you if you have questions?
You can always reach to me at my first name at gmail.com.
Terrific. Don't miss the next episode of Technology. Remember, you can always find technology podcasts on Apple, YouTube, Spotify, and SoundCloud. To our audience, remember, if you need help with any size technology project or challenge, please contact Performance Business Solutions at performancebiz.com. I'm your host, Ken Umansky, and until we meet again on another technology podcast, keep on innovating.